It was last December that Wheaton College experienced something that we haven't experienced in a long time, and it was the passing of Hudson Taylor Armerding at the age of 91 last December. The first time that had happened in 32 years that the college had lost one of its previous presidents. We are in this sesquicentennial year where one of the ways we're celebrating is thinking back over that history, is sort of retelling the college's history through the lens of its previous 6 presidents, my predecessors. And we come this morning to Hudson Armerding. We looked at Jonathan Blanchard, took Wheaton College from 1860 through the Civil War and beyond, all of the struggles of that. Charles Blanchard takes it from there, the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, all the way through World War I. Again, amazing time of stress and trying to lead the college forward. He passed the baton to J. Oliver Buswell. In 1926, Dr. Buswell takes over, and immediately upon taking over, the nation is plunged into, in fact, the world is plunged into the Great Depression. And so he's trying to lead the college all through the late 20s and the 30s of recovering from that. And then Dr. Edmond in the early 40s takes over. In 1941, he's inaugurated, and by the end of the year, you have Pearl Harbor and off into another massive world war and all the challenges for the college of that period. And it was at the end of Dr. Edmond's tenure that he passed the baton to Hudson Taylor Armerding, the 5th president of the college. Hudson was born in 1918, the first of 5 children. He came to the college and majored here in history. He became a student of Dr. Edmond, actually, while Dr. Edmond was still a professor. He became sort of a TA to Dr. Edmond. He graduated, Hudson did, in 1941, the very same year Dr. Edmond was bumped up to the presidency, and the year that we plunged into World War II. Dr. Armerding went from here to Clark University and took an MA, but immediately upon finishing that MA, he enlisted in the Navy and went off to war himself. He became a naval commander on board the USS Wichita, which saw engaged in the Far East combat 11 different times. Dr. Armerding saw some things that none of the rest of us have seen. And he didn't talk about it much, but when he did, you realize he had in fact endured combat, the only president that I'm aware of who would have seen such things. Well, he returned and went to the University of Chicago for a PhD in history. And he had finished that, and he was invited to become a dean out of Gordon College, and then the acting president, actually, of Gordon College when they were without a president, and he stepped in as acting president. In fact, it was when Dr. Edmond was out there for the inauguration of the one who became the permanent president that he had this conversation with his former TA, Dr. Armerding, would you come back to Wheaton and come here and serve as provost? And Dr. Armerding did that very thing, came back to Wheaton. And ultimately, starting in 1962, it was a few years later in 1965 when the board asked him to step up and become the president here. Once again, there was no sign that I can see of any kind of a national search. That was before things were done in the way they're done today. He was grown from inside, and he stepped in 1965 to become the president of Wheaton College. The college was very different then. There were only about 1,800 undergraduate students at that point. Today we've got closer to 2,500. What's more, the cost for 2 semesters, room, board, tuition, books was, get ready to groan, $2,100. That covered back then only about 80% of the actual costs of the students. Today, what you pay, if you pay the full sticker price and the full load, you're paying about 70% of what it actually costs on average to have you here. Hudson headed into a very difficult environment, and this is what we need to understand if we're going to grasp what was taking place in this particular era of the college's history. This was an enormous time of unrest and turmoil, more than you probably in this generation can actually appreciate. I have a special affinity for the era of Hudson Armerding because not only was Hudson an advisor and counselor and mentor to me. Once I stepped in, he became a good friend and supporter for me. But even beyond that, the era in which he was president here at Wheaton was my era on campus, college and university campus. That was when I was experiencing all of this from the ground up. He was experiencing it as the president, trying to give leadership. But it was a time when in America everything seemed to be up for grabs. The U.S. was changing dramatically, and if you stop and ask how so, you really begin to add it up and you realize what an amazing time the 60s and the 70s were in this country. Just think of some of the things that were roiling the waters in American culture at that time. You had, of course, the intensification of the Cold War that was running very hot during that time, the 50s, and then the 60s and the 70s. It was reaching something of a peak with the Soviet Union and the buildup of the nuclear arsenals. I mean, the Cold War was at its hottest at that point. We saw the emergence of the civil rights movement during the 50s, 60s, 70s, with all the exacerbation of racial tensions long-standing in America all coming to the surface. We saw the rise of the Vietnam War under Kennedy, President Kennedy, the late 50s and early 60s. Vietnam just had a few advisors, and it began to grow under Kennedy and then under President Johnson. And by the time you get into the late 60s and into the 70s, the Vietnam War and the issues around it was tearing this nation apart. Add to that the 60s and the rise of the Woodstock Generation, the celebration of the sexual revolution, as it was often called, the repudiation of almost all traditional boundaries, the rise of a counterculture, the hippies, a hedonistic drug culture that just became pervasive. It was a time of self-loathing in American culture, a time when dropping out became the good thing to do, the cool thing to do. It was a period of really unspeakable events. The assassination of a president, President Kennedy, 1963. The assassination of Martin Luther King, 1968. The assassination of Robert Kennedy in 1968. It was a time of riots and demonstrations all across the country, one after the other. Race riots out in Watts in Los Angeles, race riots in Detroit. These are in the middle 60s. Massive anti-war riots all over the country, including right here in Chicago, and maybe the biggest one, or at least the one that had the biggest impact, 1968, the Democratic National Convention. It was a time of real upheaval in this nation. And that was particularly true on college and university campuses at the time. Those of us who were in that setting at the time were seeing it on the ground. It started really on the college university campuses in 1964 with the free speech demonstration that took place at Berkeley out in California, the Berkeley campus and Sproul Plaza, thousands of students out, an amazing event that had ripple effects all across the nation, wound up costing President Clark Kerr of the Berkeley his job. We saw students by the thousands burning their draft cards during this period. I witnessed many of these events and actually participated in some of them. I never burned my draft card, but saw it up close and personal. There were sit-ins all across the country where students would come and simply come en masse into the administration, move in, sit down, wind up driving people out of their offices, pull out file drawers, trash, burn files, trash the equipment of the office. Buildings being bombed by the weathermen and others of that ilk. This was going on all across the country, and it reached some sort of an epitome, I think, in the so-called Kent State Massacre. It was an event that sent ripple effects all across the country, this great sort of crescendo. When the unthinkable happened, here were student demonstrators on the campus of Kent State University in 1970, and they called out the National Guard, and there were 4 of those students killed. As you can imagine, the thought of here you have the American military firing on American college students. Think of that. This is the kind of upheaval that was taking place in America at the time. Even as I talk about it, some of the emotions of it come back to me. It was an era that wound up seeing President Johnson run out of office, unable to run for a second time, President Nixon resigning in disgrace in Watergate, 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown, high inflation combined with high interest rates, so-called stagflation, almost 20% interest rates at one point, followed by the Arab oil embargo that shut everything down. All in all, this is one of the most difficult periods in American history, and especially on college and university campuses. Like I say, it was my era. I lived through this, and I lived it, really, I was a student and grad student during this period, and it's all very real to me. And what's more, Wheaton College did not escape this period of turmoil. Wheaton students got involved in this. Now, we didn't have any sit-ins that I'm aware of. There wasn't any violence or bombings on campus. But there were demonstrations and strong debates, and emotions were running high. There were Wheaton students in the March on Selma, Alabama in 1965 with Martin Luther King. There were Wheaton students participating in that Chicago demonstration in 1968. It was a period of tension, and Wheaton did not escape some of the unpleasantness and some of the negative effects of that period. It made its mark upon Wheaton College. College applications declined all across the nation during that time because of the upheaval, particularly on college campuses, and Wheaton did not escape that, saw a dramatic drop in college and applications. Business econ on campuses all across the country saw a major decline in majors due to the social and the political environment, and that was true at Wheaton as well. It's interesting that alumni support from that period all across the nation is lower than other eras of the college's history. That's true for us, and it's also true for other institutions across the country. This was a generation of students, several generations of students, that did not bond with their alma mater. Their college and university days were not warm and fuzzy. It was a time of upheaval, and actually I remember it well. This was the environment in which Hudson Armerding had to provide presidential leadership at Wheaton College. It's why one of the observers of this period says, in the late 60s and early 70s, a college presidency was one of the most hazardous jobs in America. The tensions were often severe enough to break the will and destroy the vision of even the most resolute. Average tenure in office was under 5 years. Well, that was the time of Hudson Armerding at Wheaton College, and he lasted 17 years, but not without a lot of wear and tear. He was a very orderly man. He was a naval officer. He wanted everything ship-shape, on board ship, a place for everything in its place. That was not a time when everything was in its place. He was a man who always wore a coat and tie, rather reserved, always dignified, rigorously punctual, rather formal in his personal style. He was a military man and supportive of the military when the military was being trashed all around him. As you can imagine, this was a hard time for him. In fact, he told me later, he said it almost did him in. Wheaton, under his leadership, tried addressing some of the challenges. For example, at one point, Wheaton changed its policy about admissions. It had never required of every single incoming student a profession of faith up to that point as a criteria for admissions. And some of that showed up during this time of upheaval where you had people on campus who seemed not to care less about trying to follow Christ in some of this. And it was during this period that Dr. Armerding changed this. Only students with a clear profession of faith who really wanted to enroll at Wheaton were enrolled. The admissions criteria changed during this very era. Dr. Armerding was resisting what has come to be called, at least in the circles in which I run, administration, maybe you've never heard the term, dry cleaner parents. You know the term helicopter parents. They hover over, all the more so today with cell phones and instant messaging, parents who just hover over their students once they go away to college, so-called helicopter parents. Well, what about dry cleaner parents? These are the ones who bring you their children and say, I've messed them up, please clean them up, I'll come back when you're through. And Dr. Armerding was resisting that move. He took the position that Christian colleges are communities of volunteers, not draftees. They're communities for education, not rehab or evangelism. Previously, the college had actually held evangelistic services twice a year, and that was when they went over to not evangelistic services, but services designed for instruction and inspiration and self-examination. It was during this period, too, that the college began interviewing every applicant, something that was later stopped, but set up 35 committees all across the country, a lot of them being alumni, to interview every single candidate coming to the college. There was a famous incident during the time of upheaval on the campus and tension and people crosswise with each other and people on the sides of the issue debating each other. And there was one, as you can imagine, this was the time of the hippies and there was a lot of long hair and pretty ragged clothing. I mean, you guys look good compared to that generation. And there was one particular fellow who had been a bit of a thorn in the side of the administration during that time and some of this. But Dr. Armerding had heard him praying for the college and praying for Dr. Armerding earlier in the day. And in chapel one day, he actually, some of this was on the table, and he asked that young man to come up here on the chapel platform. And when he went to him, and he hugged him, and he told him he loved him. And it's a testimony to the tension that existed on the campus at that point. The student body stood and gave a 5-minute standing ovation. There was such a relief in seeing that happen. There was also a well-intentioned effort back in 1968 to recruit some disadvantaged urban young people from New York and Chicago. Only 4% of the student body were minorities at that time, and they came here completely unprepared for this. The college tried to give some extra tutoring and counseling, but the culture shock was too much for them, and it didn't work. In fact, it backfired. Not a single one of them thrived here. It was not the right way to go about this, and it was not a good experiment, and we look back and learn from it ever since. We realize it's a much more difficult sort of challenge than just recruiting a bunch of certain people of color or something to the campus. That's not the way that it has to be. A fundamental change of the institution, much more long-term. And we have come a long way since then. It's a reminder to us that we have a long way to go. Wheaton also tried the quarter system during that period. Dr. Armerding went from a semester system to a quarter system. That enabled, interesting, a campus day where Wednesday was free of classes pretty much and free of chapel. The students called it Glorious Wednesday. It was a time of, it was designed for special lectures or campus events or study days or something. But that didn't work very well either. In 1981, the college went back to the semester system that you know. It was a difficult time, and the college tried some things, adjusting as they went, but you couldn't get rid of some of the turmoil. Still, in many ways, the Lord prospered Wheaton during this period of time. During Hudson's tenure, and despite the turmoil, the retention rate, despite all the upset, actually was hit record highs of about 74% of students who enroll actually going on to graduation. The average was a little above 60% at that time across the nation. For Wheaton to hit 74 was good. Today we're in the upper 80s. I mean, we're up in the stratosphere on national institutions in terms of our retention rate. But back then it hit 74%, which was very, very good. Some important buildings were added to the campus during that time: Fisher Hall, Traber, what was called the Science Hall. We know it as Armerding because later at his retirement they named it after him, but it was called the Science Hall at that time. Remember, biology and physics actually were in the old Blanchard. Before Blanchard had been redone inside, you can't even know what old Blanchard was like. Biology and physics were in Blanchard. Well, they finally got some new digs over in Armerding, and they're about ready to get some new digs that are better yet. That's about ready to come. The library, what became later Buswell Library, called Buswell Library, came into existence, was built attached to the old Nicholas Library. Krauser Fitness Center was built during this time. It was a time when the college saw some very memorable visitors: Senator Mark Hatfield, Senator George McGovern, who was running for the presidency, President Gerald Ford, Chuck Colson showed up on campus for the first time after getting out of prison. Candidate Ronald Reagan was on the campus during that time. This was the time of the founding of our hunger program. That came out of that whole generation. it was the beginning of the Wade Center. It was a wonderful thing that not the building, that's recent, but the program, the collections of the Wade Center, this spectacular world-class collection of the writings of these 7 authors centered around C.S. Lewis. Clyde Kilby, one of our English professors, had read in 1953, he read The Case for Christianity by Lewis. A decade later, he met Lewis, spent some time with him. Over time, he built a relationship with Tolkien, built a relationship with Warren Lewis, C.S. Lewis's brother. And when Lewis passed away, we got his books, his library, we got the papers, the family papers. That's a world-class collection over there, and everybody who studies in this area knows it. Well, the Billy Graham Center was built during this time, 1979. A lot of places wanted his papers. Minneapolis, Charlotte wanted his papers. Other schools, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill wanted them. Baylor wanted them. Cornell wanted them. But Billy decided to put them here and to build this Graham Center around them. He didn't really want his name on that. He kept saying he didn't want this thing to be a monument to him. The people around him insisted, both in the BGEA, his organization, and the college. And to this day, Billy says the same thing. He calls it the Wheaton Center. He can't get out the name, the Billy Graham Center. When we redid after I came, we redid the museum and upgraded it and walked through there this whole history of evangelism in America, and he was fascinated because it was much better than the previous display. We got to the part where he shows up, and he went silent, and he kind of looked around and saw this. He turned to me and he said, "Too much Billy Graham, too much Billy Graham." That's why the Lord has been able to use him the way he has. It was originally interesting. That was originally to be built back here behind Edmond, but it was too big, so they wound up having to move the service center, Chase Service Center down, and put the Graham Center down there. Well, in so many ways, the college prospered during this time. It was a time of turmoil, and yet the Lord moved the college forward under the leadership of Hudson Armerding. So that at the end of his 17 years, there was real progress. By the time he finished, the faculty was stronger, the students were stronger. He had graduated 9,700 men and women out into the world to make a difference for the Lord. The endowment had gone from 8 million up to 30 million, 7 major buildings added to the campus. At his farewell event from the college, Professor Jerry Hawthorne, who was the vice chair of the faculty at that point, said it well. He said, "Behind his customary reserve, there is a truly warm and friendly person, tender even, with a good sense of humor, a person intelligent and compassionate, dedicated to Christ as Lord, and committed to keeping Wheaton College consistent with its motto." The last time Hudson spoke on this campus, it was from this platform back in 1996. And he spoke, his text was our year verse, this sesquicentennial verse, Psalm 145:4. "One generation will commend your works to another. They will tell of your mighty acts." It was a wonderful moment. When he finished, the students stood and gave him a standing ovation. It was a fitting conclusion for this naval commander who the Lord used to captain Wheaton College through some of its most challenging times. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for Hudson, for his faithfulness, for his integrity, his love for you, his wisdom and strength, and courage shown throughout his life. We thank you that you raised him up along with these other men to give leadership to this place, and that under his leadership you grew and strengthened Wheaton College. We are the beneficiaries today of what these earlier generations have done, and we give you thanks for each one of them, for their faithfulness, and ultimately to your faithfulness. We give thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless.